Still loading, and we are live. Cool. So thank you very much, Christian, for joining me today for another episode of Spacepan's webinar series. In today's episode, we are going to be focusing on slips, trips, and falls. And today's guest is Christian Harris. Christian, how are you doing today?
Yeah, very well. Thanks, Ronan. Thank you for having me.
Nice. You are very, very welcome. So, how did you get into slip safety? Where did it all start?
It's a great question. So basically, two things converged. Back in 2012, I was spending a very enjoyable Sunday morning and afternoon with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, in London, pottering around, having lunch, so on and so forth. And then we started to head home, parked our car in a Sainsbury's car park in Angel Islington in London, started walking from the car park to the front of the store, and then that's the last thing I remember for several hours. A car basically had sped around the corner, gone too fast, lost control, swerved a bit, mounted the curb, and ploughed into me from my left-hand side. So I broke my collarbone, my wrist, my ankle. I've got various cuts and scars all down this side, neck damage, and various other things. So I always say it was obviously very unlucky that it happened, but lucky that it wasn't much worse. So that's the first thing that happened to me, which is this event, which obviously was totally unexpected and changes your life and makes you think quite carefully and in a very passionate way about safety. So that kind of is what ignited my interest in safety. So why slips is the second bit converging, which was my kind of background before that. So I was working as a management consultant, so it was very much around data, trends, markets, where things are going, what are the drivers, and so on and so forth. So I started taking a very analytical approach, looking into the safety world, and I discovered this big category of slips, trips, and falls, which was not only the biggest cause of accidents, injuries, and claims, but also was very, very flat. So that suggested to me, there's a game worth playing there because there's a big potential prize, and nobody seems to have solved it so far. Whereas road safety, which is what you might think I would have automatically gone into, actually the performance is quite good there. So that's kind of what got me involved, and then I've been working in this field ever since.
Nice. Yeah, we took part in the Lloyd's Lab Accelerator last year, and we looked at all of the insurance hazards and which ones are most prevalent.
Yeah,
and it blew my mind seeing the trips and falls, where I think it's 20% or 30% of all business claims are trips and falls. You're going to know that number.
Yeah, I mean, it depends by sector a little bit, but if you look at reportable accidents, it tends to be about a third across all sectors. If you look at the data from AXA, so AXA is one insurer in the UK. From 2018, they spent £80 million of claim costs on slips in that year. The next biggest was manual handling, which was 30 million, and then trips was on top of that. So slips was 2.5 times the size of manual handling, and then trips is on top of that as well. So yeah, it's a massive problem.
What? Yeah. I mean, how do you prevent? I'm going to ask a $1 million question here, but how do you prevent a slip, trip, and fall? Is it just you're cleaning the floor or wearing different shoes? How does it work?
No, well, that is the perception, right? So the perception is that it's quite a simple thing to solve, and I think that's what's kind of holding us back a little bit. So, I wouldn't say that we're doing a bad job because that sort of 30%, as I say, is pretty flat. So if we were doing a terrible job, that would be much higher and it would be getting worse. So we're not doing a bad job; we're doing a pretty good job. But I think, there's a few sort of mindset challenges around this issue. So one of them is people think that it's quite simple, and therefore they take simple steps to address it, and those simple steps are not quite enough to fully address it. So we need to go a bit deeper. The other thing is we bundle together slips, trips, and falls as a single category, and even HSE is guilty of this. But actually, if you've got a problem with people slipping, then what you need to do about it is very, very different than if you've got a problem with people tripping. So I always encourage people to think about these two as kind of distinct. So, is it a slip or is it a trip? So if you sort of just at a starting, headline level were open-minded about maybe we could do a bit more and willing to look at the two things differently, that alone would be a good starting point.
Cool. And you had said, if my memory serves me right, that you can reduce slips, trips, and falls by 57% by using.
Yeah, that's an average of what our clients see. Yeah, that's more than achievable. I mean, we've seen people eliminate these things from happening. I'd never promise anybody that, because you can't promise that, but you can make a massive difference. So we've seen 60% reduction in Euston train station, for example, with massive footfall. So if it can work there, then it should be able to work for you. We've seen 85% reduction in 3-star hotels in and out of bathtubs and shower trays, where the floor surface is like designed to be wet. So therefore, it's you can't say, oh, keep the floor dry, because it's always going to be wet. Similar things in around swimming pools. We helped a national swimming pool operator to reduce their slip claims from 1 per week to 1 per month. So again, a big decrease, not an elimination, but a massive decrease. And all of those things are possible, and I share them as examples across different sectors to show that you can do something. But think about it from the perspective of pounds and shillings. Making those improvements made those organizations quite a lot of extra profit, because they saved a lot of money from accidents and claims, and they also got additional tangential benefits as well, which you may not think about, but they actually were selling more as a result of being safer too.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's because it seems like such a niche problem, when the reality is, like, with the examples that you gave, you realize that it's so prevalent, like in modern day life. Like, we've all been to hotels where because you get out of the shower, you almost fall as you walk in. Like, it's such a part of daily lives, but it's not a problem that shoots you in the face the second you see it until it's explained in the way that you have done.
That's the thing. I think everyone knows it's a problem. Again, this is one of the challenges that I face working in this field. Everyone knows it's a problem, but it's kind of, how serious a problem is it? And of course, if you aggregate all of that data like you did at the Lloyd's lab, and like I just gave you examples from, then you see, wow, that's a big problem. I mean, look, it was a big enough problem during the COVID pandemic. Chris Whitty actually mentioned during one of those, famous press conference briefings at Number 10, we've got the COVID problem, and we've also got the slips, trips, and falls problem coming into the winter. So, people know it's a big problem, but they sort of feel as if it maybe is. I mean, look, it's rare that somebody dies, but it's not. It does happen, like, several times a year, but it's rare that somebody dies. So, it's kind of understandable how somebody would think, oh, we need to focus in on the things that are going to kill people, of course. But actually, this is hurting a lot of people, and it's hurting a lot of organisations. P&Ls, bottom lines, balance sheets, etc. as well.
And it's not life-threatening; it's life-changing. Like, on multiple occasions.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been involved in deaths. I've been involved in, very, very serious, brain injuries and amputations, and so absolutely, life-altering. Even if you slip and you break your elbow, that can be life-altering, or break your ankle or something. So, but life-threatening is lower.
Yeah, and I mean, you've narrowed down your knowledge, and not narrowed down. Your knowledge is now so large in this particular topic that you decided to write a book on it. So, do you want to tell me a little bit more about the book that you've written?
Yeah. So it's a good point about sort of narrowing down. So I always say to health and safety professionals, which I'm guessing is going to be the audience here, you need to think of yourself like a GP. So the GP sits at his or her desk, and every 20 minutes someone comes through the door and they present with a problem, and that problem could be on any number of things. So you have to have the knowledge to be able to diagnose those problems, and therefore your knowledge needs to be a mile wide. But if you've got knowledge a mile wide, it can only ever be an inch deep. Whereas what I do is I don't have that mile wide knowledge. My knowledge is an inch wide and a mile deep. So I'm kind of like a surgeon, let's say, for your GP. So you would refer to me. And I think a health and safety professional can never be a specialist, as much as they might want to be. They can never be a specialist. If you're doing that broad role, you have to be a generalist. And so having the specialist people, the surgeons in that analogy to refer to is really always very, very useful. So that, I find that's quite a good analogy to use. And as you say, yeah, with that kind of, inch wide, mile deep knowledge, I've written a book which is called Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology. Slipology is kind of my way of trying to bring together slips and science and try and get people again to open their eyes and think about this in a slightly different way. The book came out recently. Really, really happy that we got best-selling book on Amazon for safety and best-selling book on Amazon for insurance. So that kind of ticked those boxes, and we're getting some great reviews and stuff from it. So yeah, really, really pleased to get that out there.
Nice. They're huge categories to get a bestseller in.
Yeah. I sort of thought we'd get safety. I was a bit shocked to get insurance because you just don't know how many. I mean, how many books are sold on insurance in any given day? I don't know is the answer. I know how many books we sold. And it's not done. I don't think it's done on like a day. I think it's done on it's over a period of a week or something. But yeah. So it was. I mean, look, I think if you wanted to get bestseller for I don't know, personal branding or marketing, you've got to sell a significant amount more books than we sold. But yeah, no, it was good. It was definitely good to get that.
It's still an accolade, nevertheless. I mean, you
Yeah,
are
it's great. Yeah.
It's the reason we're speaking today.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah. Well, it's always interesting, isn't it? Because the word authority includes the word author. So there's a lot of people that would say that unless you've written a book on something, how can you really be an authority or an expert or a specialist or whatever? I don't really like the word expert, but because I think if you start saying you're an expert, then you're leaving yourself open to being challenged. Yeah. Specialist is something I prefer to use as a word, but yeah, I think writing a book about something really is a beneficial thing to do because it obviously the idea is to give value to people, and the book basically sets out lots of principles and gives you examples and case studies of what to do and why and when and so on and so forth. So that's the primary objective, to be giving value, but it's actually very beneficial for you as well, because to sit down and write that book, you've actually got to really clarify your thinking, disseminate it in a kind of structured way with a lot of clarity. Yeah, so I certainly would recommend it to people. It's very time consuming and difficult, but
how long does it take?
Great. Yeah. Well, I first started wanting to write the book in 2020, and then I probably wrote about 10,000 words in 2020, and then it kind of sat on the shelf for 3 years. So I would say that the honest truth is I've probably done it in about 6 to 9 months. Yeah, and obviously that's not my full-time job, but what I try to do is kind of get into a rhythm of trying to do sort of 1,000 words a day or something like that. So if you sit down and write 1,000 words and you've got a plan and a structure of how the book's gonna be, actually writing 1,000 words a day is not that difficult or that time consuming. So if you can just sort of churn out 1,000 words a day, and then you end up with a very long manuscript, and then it's about like the editing and shrinking it down and stuff. But yeah, that's kind of how I went about it.
Nice. Yeah, it's a very interesting process. It's one of those things that you never really know how these books get written.
Yeah. There's some good there are some good webinars and good, there's even books about how to write books as well, interestingly. So just like anything in life, people have tried to come up with principles and processes and stuff, and then they'll teach you or charge you to help you or whatever. And obviously, if you go down the route of getting a sort of book contract with a proper publisher like a Wiley or something like that, then I think for that they would have a very firm process of their own that you would go through. I sort of it's not self-published because I've got a publisher to help me with it and edit it and so on, but it's kind of it was more the actual writing of the book was kind of more down to me, and then the editor came in when I'd written it to sort of help me condense it and make it more, shine it up and make it look nice and polished and ready to go.
Nice. And they all work because you've got the bestseller category.
Seems to, yeah.
Cool. So if we bring the conversation back to slips, trips, and falls, so a number of slips, trips, and falls at work is massive, right? It's as you've said at the beginning of the call, it's such a huge problem. But surely there's also so many incidents that go unnoticed or unreported that are just minor incidents at work. Do you find this when you're doing consulting in businesses that often that's the case, that they don't even know the problem until a big event happens?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really a key point, because if you don't know what's really happening, then you can understand why people would perceive that this as not being that big an issue. Whereas if we were actually really accurately able to measure all of these near misses, I think that would probably spur people into a little bit more action than we maybe see. I'll give you an example. The HSE were working with the National Gallery in London. I don't believe this was an enforcement issue. I think it was a kind of consulting thing that the HSE were doing. And I think I'm right in saying that the National Gallery gets about 4 million visitors a year. And what the HSE did was they set up video cameras and they recorded every single entrance of the gallery for 12 hours, video taped it. And then they went back and watched all of that footage with a view to sort of understanding, right, what was happening around slips, trips and falls at the entrances. Now, during that 12-hour period, there were 0 incidents reported to the National Gallery. So as far as they would be aware, nothing happened. When the HSE reviewed all the data, they saw, I think from memory, something like half a dozen or maybe a few more people who they said appeared to be seriously hurt. And they saw another, I think, 30 or 40 people who obviously suffered some kind of incident, but it wasn't reported. So that gives you an idea of the fact that actually, just in that 12-hour period, there are a number of incidents that weren't reported at all, that illustrate the point that we're not doing very good at tracking the near misses.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of Spaceman's almost exact position in the market. There's so many blind spots in the health and safety space that people are so blissfully unaware of that they have to wait for a big event to be able to make a reactive change. Whereas if you can get those blind spots, then you can be proactive and you can stop the big event ever occurring. But without knowing, there's no point in investing your time in improving it.
No, yeah, and that's what's exciting about what you guys do in this field and others, as well as there's some great tech around video monitoring and AI, and there's lots of things you can do. And I really encourage people to try and get on top of that near miss piece, because I do think that it's a bit like the Pandora's box. I think if the Pandora's box were opened, people would realize that this is affecting a lot more of their customers, team members, suppliers, etc., than they thought. And I think that would help to encourage people just to be, that little bit more proactive. And going back to what we said at the start, I don't believe that we're doing a terrible job. I believe we're doing a pretty good job. But actually, the difference that I've seen in that sort of 57% reduction is going from good to great, and that isn't a big leap. But it just takes that little bit of extra time and effort.
Yeah. And do you think, in general, just safety legislation as a whole does enough to prevent slips, trips, and falls and general near misses?
I mean, the challenge in the UK with safety legislation is that obviously it's very open in lots of areas. It's very open to interpretation. So what does reasonably practicable mean to you versus me versus someone else? I know there are some areas of safety where there are very specific things put in. What's interesting about slips, and we'll forget trips for the moment, is when you go to court for a slip claim, what tends to be the case is that they get some slip testing done, and it depends whether you pass or fail the slip test as to whether that claim is successful or not. So the case law is suggesting that actually there is this black and white benchmark that is going to deem to be success or failure. when it comes to the claim. But the legislation doesn't speak to that at all, and many people have never heard of this till that bad thing happens. So I do think that there could be a better clarification, a bit more of a robust clarification, and I do feel like it warrants it in this space because it is such a big problem. If slips, trips, and falls was a tenth of the size that it is, then I don't think it'd be hard for me to sort of stand here or sit here and say I think the legislation should be tightened up, because actually it would then be fairly insignificant. But it is a big problem. It is costing a lot of money. It's putting a huge strain on the NHS. It's the biggest cause of admissions to the NHS. It's the biggest cause of bed days in the NHS. So for UK PLC, for the government, etc., it's a problem that would be worth solving. So I do think that we should be doing a bit more.
Nice. And then moving away then from legislation to take it a step beneath, is there enough that employers are doing? Like, should employers be held liable for slips that happen within their workplace, or should it be a employee versus employee responsibility, or where do you sit in that?
Well, in America, lots of the states have a system whereby if a member of staff hurts themselves and puts in a claim, then they automatically get paid out. I don't believe that that's the way to go, because I do think that there is a level of personal responsibility in this. If you're at work and the procedure says to do X and you do Y, and you kind of knowingly go against that and then you hurt yourself, I think that's obviously, that's a difficult situation, but one that I think you have to bear some responsibility for. But I think that looking at it in the sort of inverse way, we're quite quick to rush to blame the person that slipped over or tripped over, and we don't often sort of step back and think, did they fall because of something we did? We sort of rush into they were wearing the wrong shoes, or they were rushing, or they weren't paying attention, or whatever it might be. And obviously those can be contributing factors. And we can run through, if you like, the six. There's a sort of model that I have of the 6 key reasons why somebody would slip. And human behavior is obviously part of that. But fundamentally, we have to create an environment and maintain an environment that is safe for its intended use. So, if we have a pub, let's say, just to turn around and say, well, of course, that person slipped over. Did you see the high heels they were wearing? I don't think that's true. I don't think that's justifiable. You should be managing the risk, mitigating the risk of people that are wearing high heels, because it's reasonable and expected for people to wear high heels in a pub. If they're wearing high heels around a swimming pool, then I'd be saying, well, that's ridiculous, and we're into that personal responsibility. But I think quite often we rush to blame the person, and we don't sort of look in the mirror enough and say, have we really done everything we can to have prevented this from happening?
Nice. That's a very, very valid point. And what are those 6 key attributing factors? I don't know the right way to say it.
So this is on slips. Let's do trips first. So there are 4 things for trips, and it's an acronym TRIP. So tidy, route, identify, plan. So a trip happens because of a low level obstruction that either somebody doesn't see, or they do see and they can't avoid for whatever reason. So, and there are 2 types of those obstructions. There are temporary obstructions like trailing cables, or a cardboard box that's left on the floor that shouldn't be there, and then there are permanent ones like a step. So, how do we solve trips? We tidy. So that is dealing with those temporary obstructions and doing good housekeeping. We route. So that means trying to create defined walkways and getting people walking in the same space. And what does that mean? It means that, let's say we're in a factory, if we have defined walkways, we can focus in our efforts around trip prevention on the walkways rather than having to worry about the whole factory. So by focusing our effort, we've got more chance of making it work. We identify, so that's raising awareness so people understand these things that they need to do, but also it's getting people to actually take that personal responsibility of spotting the hazard and then dealing with the hazard, because trip hazards can be seen. That's one big difference between trip and slip hazards. You can't necessarily see a slip hazard, whereas you can see a trip hazard. And then P is plan. So that's all about bringing this together, design and maintenance, and setting up the environments in the right way. So that's how you deal with trips, TRIP, trip. And then slips, there's a bit more to it. So there are 6 key reasons, and I've pulled that together into a acronym called CHIMES. So I say tune your chimes to stop slips. C is contamination. So what's on the floor? So if a floor is perfectly clean and perfectly dry, then nobody's going to slip. But as soon as there's anything that's a barrier between the foot and the floor, then somebody might slip. So that could be water, it could be grease, it could be dust, it could be anything really that could be a barrier. H is heel, so that's the footwear. So again, we spoke a bit about high heels, but there's also issues around safety footwear. So just because you've got safety footwear doesn't necessarily mean that it's slip resistant, and it might not be slip resistant everywhere. So you might have footwear that's really good in a kitchen, but it wouldn't be any good for your gardeners, for example. I is individual. This is the human factors. So this is a bit about demographics. So gender and age play a role. If you're an 80-year-old woman, you're more likely to slip and fall than if you're a 20-year-old man, according to the data. And you're also more likely to be seriously hurt, and that's more expensive. But what we really mean about individual is all of these behaviors. So if we're doing anything like twisting, turning, pushing, pulling, carrying, if we're rushing, if we're distracted, all of these things can make us more likely to slip and fall. So therefore, what can we do to manage and mitigate those activities? M is maintenance, and that splits neatly into 3. Change of use. So if you reconfigure buildings, COVID was a good example of this. We had people walking in strange places they never walked before. We had hand sanitizer stations, meaning that floors were getting wet in areas that they wouldn't normally have got wet. Wear and tear, so things change over time. Go to a church and you see the stone floor has worn. That's going to change the slip resistance. And then cleaning is a big contributor. E is environment, so this is about obviously the weather and condensation and things like that, but it's also about the built environment. So entrance matting, steps and stairs, ramps and slopes, lighting, noise, things like that. And then S is surface, which is the floor. So some floors are more slippery than other floors. And the key thing with floors is lots of slips happen on floors that look anti-slip. But just because they look like they should be okay doesn't mean they necessarily are. When you're walking, you are not actively, but you're sort of intuitively looking for hazards. And so if you're walking on a floor and it looks like it should be the sort of floor that's not very slippery, you take less care. Whereas if you're walking on a sort of shiny, polished terrazzo floor, you do take a bit more care. So interestingly, a lot of accidents happen on floors that look like they should be anti-slip, but they're not. So that's the 6 areas, and then obviously there's quite a lot of depth between among all of those, and then the book runs through all of those areas and gives you more detail. But basically, when I have gone into organizations and they're doing pretty well, they're doing well on those 6 things. When I get invited in, when someone's had a bad incident or their data spiked or whatever, and I explain those 6 areas, most people say, didn't realize there was as much to this as that, and we're probably only working 1 or 2 of the areas.
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea there was so much depth to it, and I'm spending most of my days within HSE guidance and OSHA guidance to go and build technology that will resolve some of these pains. Yeah, it's like a whole category in itself.
Yeah, but you'll find that in every area of safety. Again, the GP, they need to have a certain level of knowledge, and that's what's kind of reflected in a lot of the generalist advice and the legislation. And then it's kind of right, how can we go that level deeper? And I'm sure if you had someone on to talk about manual handling or any of these other things, there'll be a lot more to it than you initially would have thought, I'm sure.
Yeah. Cool. And do you think that technology is doing enough to present slips, trips, and falls? I keep categorizing them because it's easier to position the
Yeah,
question.
no, that's fine, and it's no worries to do that. So I think my fear around technology is that, and this is not just in slips, trips, and falls. It's about safety. It's around safety as a whole. Is that sometimes people can think of technology as a bit of a crutch. There's no such thing as a panacea. And so, for example, we've seen people in my space saying, "Oh, buy this robotic cleaning machine, and this will solve this problem for you because it'll make sure that the floor is always clean and dry." But as you've just heard, that's only one element. Or buy this CCTV monitoring AI system, and this will solve this problem for you. And well, that's only dealing with one thing. So I think I'm a huge fan of technology. I love AI. I love making things more efficient and more effective. So I'm really on board with it. I always just give people a slight sort of caveat of you need to understand what it's actually doing and making sure that you are getting a robust and a holistic system together. But yeah, so that's a bit of a caveat, but hopefully with a positive spin that I do believe it's making a difference.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I also agree. Like, we're a technology provider, but it's always going to need some level of human input.
Yeah, we chatted a bit about that, didn't we? When you came on my podcast, and we chatted a bit about that, and I think we were kind of on the same kind of page. So I think there's a responsibility on the the health and safety manager or whoever the buyer is to kind of do a bit of due diligence, and I think there's also a bit of a responsibility, like there is for everybody that's providing a product or a service or a solution, to sort of be upfront and honest. And like I said at the start, we have seen people eliminating. I'd never say to somebody, "This will eliminate your risk," because it's just not true.
Yeah. And then taking a step past, I mean, you mentioned AI there, but taking a step past just generic technology, how do you feel like AI is going to shape up and change the slips, trips, and falls category as a whole? Will we get to a point where just the database is so good?
Yeah, it would be really interesting if we could create some kind of AI to measure or assess in some way how slippery a floor is. At the moment, we have to use this big contraption called a pendulum test, and it's in this massive box and takes time, and you have to know how to do it, and so on and so forth. It'd be great if you could have a little phone app and sort of look at what is this supposed to look like. I think there might be a way. I've been thinking a lot about this. I think there might be something around maybe like measuring with some kind of laser type or sensor, the sort of roughness of the floor, and or maybe looking at through imaging, looking at the change in appearance of the floor from the perspective of is it dirtier than it was. And so there might be something that could we could come up with, but I don't think it's kind of imminent. But I think sort of stepping above slips, trips, and falls and thinking about safety, what I think is really cool around technology is I think that it can help the safety professional to add more value, because I think a lot of the functional stuff that we need to do can be done with AI, and therefore it becomes more about your ability to influence, to explain, to build relationships, to do all the kind of soft skills, which I don't think the AI can do. So I think actually it presents a good opportunity to raise awareness, to build credibility, to influence more, to get safety seen as more something that is a driver of profitability within an organization rather than a cost and a pain in the bum. So yeah, I'm quite excited.
Yeah, it's like an efficiency management tool as opposed to the 100% of the answer. But I mean, you just made a very good point about ROI. How do companies generally validate like an ROI on your services as an example? Is it always on the cost reduction or profitability, or where do you usually sit?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, and it varies depending on who they are. So, the easiest kind of case is if you've got somebody that has a number of sites and they have quite a lot of accidents, and they're spending quite a lot of money on dealing with those accidents. And therefore, if you can say, right, well, by doing X, Y, and Z, we can reduce that number from 20 to 5, let's say, whatever that number is, they can then extrapolate out what that would mean to them in terms of savings. That's kind of a very straightforward one. When somebody is trying to be a bit more proactive and they haven't necessarily got the incident data to back it up, then it becomes a little bit more challenging. But that's where taking this kind of scientific approach that I speak about, we can measure a lot of the inputs in this space. So therefore, you might not have the output data because you're either pretty good or you've been lucky or whatever it is, but you don't have the incidents at the end. But you can measure a lot of these inputs, and you can track those inputs, and therefore you can see, right, you can prove the improvements that you've made. And so that is a way of achieving an ROI. There's also some really interesting stuff that, like, tangentially. So, for example, we worked with a swimming pool company, I think I mentioned earlier. Yes, we managed to help them to drive down their incidents and their claims significantly. But what was kind of more interesting to them was, in doing that, we drove up their standards. So their cleanliness of their poolside change room showers went up, and the net promoter score, member feedback went up, and their attrition of members leaving went down, and their ability to sell more memberships went up. So actually, it produced a profit from a sales and retention perspective, as well as a profit from a lowering of costs through claims perspective. So in lots of sectors, dealing with slips, trips, and falls is going to mean you produce a more inviting, cleaner, more hygienic environment. And there's a lot of data in different sectors which shows, that type of environment is going to lead to more sales. So there's a sort of weird, unexpected benefit there that people can get to. And I suppose the third thing I'd say is around insurance. So lots of the work we do is funded or part funded by insurance companies. So I can think of one good example would be a property owner. They have shopping centres and office buildings. They kind of identified slips as a risk. They engaged with the insurance company. We got brought in by the insurance company. The insurance company funded my team to go and visit all of their sites and do assessments for them and slip tests and so on and so forth. So the insurance company paid for that, but they also got a 65k reduction in their premium just for being on board for looking at the risk. So it's about, I think you said earlier, it's about 30% of your premium, even if you don't actually have a slip, trip, fall claim experience, because it's so endemic, it's kind of built in. Yeah. So whatever you can do to demonstrate that you're really on top of that, there's a potential saving there of, again, it's not going to go down from 30% to zero, but it can go quite significantly down if you can be proactive. So yes, there's a few different ways of trying to think of an ROI.
Nice, yeah. Insurance companies do love that reactivity.
Yeah, and also I've got to say as well, I've got this because I'm thinking about this with a business hat on. Fundamentally, we're keeping people safer. So any one person that we stop from hurting themselves, that in itself has to be a big ROI. It's obviously difficult to prove you prevented something, but we can't forget that.
No, exactly. We're playing the same game. Like it's the cost of life, not just the cost of the money that goes into it. And you spoke there about earlier in one of your points about being able to attribute the number of slips, trips, or falls, and then seeing a reduction or an increase over time. Space Bands will come to the assistance there in the very near future when we last the trips and falls feature.
And the near miss reporting. Yeah, exactly. Because another thing I would say is, and this is where I think you guys can help too, because we have those mindset challenges that I spoke about. What you often find is people have some policies and procedures, but they're typically quite brief and they're typically very generic, and they're not specific enough. So I remember speaking to a barrister on my podcast, and I asked him two interesting questions which are relevant here. One was, are you better to have the world's best health and safety policy, all singing, all dancing, page after page after page, but not be able to prove you've actually implemented it, or have something on the back of a fag packet which you can absolutely prove you've done? And he said, you're better off having something that's shorter, but you've got the proof. And the other thing I asked him about was specificity. So, again, is it best to have an all singing, all dancing thing that's very generic, or something that's briefer but it's very, very specific with targeted actions for specific locations? And he said the latter. So one of the mistakes that people make is they have kind of quite generic risk assessments, policies, and procedures. And what they should be doing is focusing in on the areas where they're actually having incidents or the risk is actually highest. So if you think about a hotel, and we think about slips, the corridor between the bedrooms on the 8th floor, there's almost a 0% statistical chance somebody's going to slip there. So therefore, that is where you have your very generic, we clean the floors and we look for spillages, and that's perfect. But in your kitchen for your staff, or in your swimming pool for your guests, or in your washrooms, or your entrance area, or your guest bathrooms, bathtubs and shower trays, we know in those environments the floor is going to be wet or contaminated, and therefore we should be doing something much more specific and robust in those areas. So there's a very long way of saying that actually getting that data of the near misses and the incidents and pinpointing where these things are happening and then putting effort into those areas is really valuable as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And then just to wrap everything up, the big final question I have for you is, if there was just one message that you could give to business owners about reducing their slips, trips, or falls, what would it be?
I thought you were going to ask me the meaning of life.
Close. That'll be for the next time.
I got asked the meaning of life once. I applied, so I went to university. I went to university at St Andrews, which I loved. But I applied to Cambridge, and I had an interview. I was, what was I reading? I think I was reading Camus or something like that. So I did French, and it's all existentialism and about the meaning of life and stuff. So we were chatting all about this, and then one of them turned around and said, "So what do you think the meaning of life is?" And I was like, I can't remember what I said, actually. I need to think about what I said. I think I probably said that it's about that you can look at it two ways. You can look at it from the perspective of, what's the meaning of a human life? Well, it's actually to create offspring and protect your offspring, and that's the functional meaning of life. But then there's the kind of more vital meaning of life, which is to aspire and to dream and to achieve and so on and so forth. I think that's how I would have answered it. That's how I'd answer it now, anyway. So, which is, I think that's an all right answer. But going back to what's the message? So it'd be very easy for me to say buy my book, but I won't say that. I think the key thing I would say to people is that these incidents are not inevitable. You can stop them, but you just need to do that a little bit more and be open-minded to investigate what that is. But if you do that, you will get a reward.
Perfect. A good answer for a question that very much put you on the spot.
That's okay.
Cool. So that wraps us up. Thank you so much for taking part in this, Christian. Today's call has been really fun. So I will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, cheers.
Bye.